Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today we will be listening to the second part of What If Didn't Believe All Might and Remained Quirkless. If you enjoy, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing down below, and don't forget to hit that bell icon so you get notified when videos go live. Now, without further ado, let's get into the video. Chapter 3, Izuku being a hero fan but not playing Trivia Pursuit in canon yet is a crime. Izuku wanted to miss his graduation from Alderaan. He didn't want to see his old classmates ever again, and he could afford to miss one day off from his education. The thought of how his flesh would burn kept him up that night. He shifted in his bed, desperately trying to get comfortable. There was no luck. Kiken's grins met his eye any time he dared shut his eyes. The bed felt like rocks. It wasn't the first time he wanted to bunk off school. Izuku knew exactly how to do it. He sat up and swung his legs out of his bed. His feet stepped on the soft carpet as he padded towards the bathroom. He knelt on the cold floor and tilted his head into the bowl. Izuku shoved 2 fingers down his throat and moved them around until he puked. He bent over the toilet. When his gut left his stomach, it landed in the bowl. It reeked of rice and stomach acid, leaving Izuku wanting to puke without forcing himself to. Inko caught a waft of the smell and hurried to the bathroom. There she saw her son heaving again. She fell to her knees and rubbed a circle on his back. The gesture made Izuku look up to see his mum smiling through the stench. He had to throw his head back into the bowl. His throat burned and every part of him felt disgusting. Izuku, do you think you're going to? Inko made a vague hand gesture towards the bowl. Izuku shook his head when he looked up. I feel fine now. The smell made it worse. He trailed off. Izuku had no idea how he ended up puking the third time. Last time he forced himself to bunk off school, he ended up going twice after it had gone wrong. 3 times, hurt. It didn't hurt as much as having one of his classmates' boulder hands smash into his chest. Kiken's explosions burning his skin were worse. That didn't mean it was painless though. Can I have some water? He asked. Inko nodded and hurried away from his side to grab a glass and fill it. There was only a short time gap, so Izuku rushed up to the sink and rinsed the 2 fingers. He hadn't been quick enough removing them this time, leaving them bloodied and disgusting. The water washed away anything that clung to them. When Inko's footsteps approached the bathroom, he twisted the tap off and curled back by the bowl. The door opened as Inko looked in on her son. She sat down beside him again and handed him the glass of water. Izuku offered her an uneasy smile before he gulped it down. The water washed down the remains of vomit that clung to his throat. It still felt icky, but without wet sun-dried tomatoes down his throat, it felt like he could breathe again. He reached up and turned on the tap water. This time, when he raised the water to his lips, Izuku took a sip. Do you want to talk about why you want to bunk on your last day? Inko asked. Izuku placed the glass down. He whispered, how'd you know? In response, Inko took hold of his fingers. These 2 were covered in puke. I know you made yourself do it to get a day off sick. Also, she raised a hand towards his forehead so it rested there, you also don't have that fever that went round in winter. I don't know what else you could have come down with that would cause you to puke. Izuku shrinked away. I'm sorry. I can go into school if you want. Oh no, you don't, Midoriya. Izuku. Come back here and explain to me what's got you so worried that you don't want to say bye to any of your classmates. Inko asked. She didn't inch closer to her son. Instead she let him shuffle against the tiles until he was leaning against her side. I'm not close to anyone there, and, he trailed off as he thought of the best way to dance around the fact he'd be beaten to the pulp. I don't want them to have fun while they leave me out. I know what will happen anyways. The whole speech will be about how much potential we all have. Our principal looks forward to seeing the alumni become functioning members of society. Inko let Izuku speak. She didn't cut in until he had finished his paragraph. I remember my last day of middle school to be really exciting. Even if all I did was sleep until we threw a party. You should go. Even if it's just to say goodbye to them all. Izuku shook his head. Wouldn't it be more beneficial for me to stay at home and study for UA's exams? Instead of wasting a whole day, saying goodbye to people who won't remember in 3 years. He suggested. Inko thought about it. How about we make a deal? She said. Depends what the deal is. Izuku responded. Cheek. She squashed him against her side with the arm she had wrapped around him. If you stay at home and study, You have to promise when you get into UA to never do this again. Izuku nodded, I'll try. Thanks mom. Inko unwrapped a hand from Izuku when she stood up, it's still way too early to study so go back and sleep. I'll see you at a reasonable time in the morning. She ruffled his hair before heading back to her room. Izuku almost followed her to her room like he always did when he was sick before he stopped. He had already bothered Inko enough already and he wasn't at risk of randomly vomiting again. With no reason not to, Izuku entered his room and changed out of his previous night clothes. He chucked the old ones into the bin and clambered back into bed. Izuku was out like a light now that he didn't have to worry about dealing with Kikin at school again. Midoriya! Yurika yelled. She was halfway across the beach with a levitating table in the air. Midoriya turned around to see her waving at him. I was wondering if I'd see you again. The beach is pretty lonely and there's only so many times I can play my music playlist. Are you free? It'd be neat to have some companionship while I clean this place up. Izuku nodded and yelled back, sure. Hang on, let me figure out how to get to you. He hopped off the promenade and waded through the sea of crisp packets that had washed up over the airs. Most of it was eroded, so there wasn't much risk of him injuring himself on a glass bottle. The biggest issue was how to stop his leg from being sucked into the never-ending depths. With coordination, Izuku landed on the blank area of land Yurika had cleared out. There were still 3 months till the entrance exam and she had a quarter left to clean. If Izuku had thought he might have walked through the clean parts to Yurika. But no, instead he had waded through a mess. How did you get here and to the bin with no issue? That felt like a workout. Izuku complained as he crouched down. Yurika looked down on him. It wasn't that hard. I just made it float while I take everything. It's especially useful for keeping down the nausea, she said. Izuku got literal stars in his eyes at the mention of the pink-cheeked girl's quirk. You can make things float? That's amazing. How does it work? Can you fly or would you float into space with no direction? When you go pro, making yourself fly would be really effective. You're aiming for UA, right? Ask their support department for a prototype. I would design one but I'm not really sure how it would work. I just think you have a cool quirk. Yurika stared at the boy in front of her. Her jaw dropped halfway through the analysis. When he stopped to take a gasp for air, she answered, I don't actually know how my quirk works but I negate the effect of gravity on an object. It makes me puke when I do too much. That's why I'm training here. I need to up my tolerance if I want to be the best hero I can be. Izuku narrowed his eyes as he tried to crack down how her quirk worked. In that time Yurika had maneuvered the table round to the growing pile of mess she had cleaned up. She had bent down to pick up a chair leg when Izuku pushed down on one of her pressure points. She looked up at the green-haired kid. What are you doing? She asked. Izuku instantly stepped back, he covered his face. He stayed in the position for a few more seconds before returning back to an average normal being. Well, I thought pressing on your pressure points might help with the nausea. Especially with how much you've already done. Yurika looked back at Izuku, what now? She asked. The bottle in her hand dropped to the floor as she questioned what Izuku was talking about. Recognizing the doubt, Izuku asked. Can I show you something? Sure. Izuku took Yurika's wrist and pressed down. His finger rubbed circles there while he pressed down. You have a pressure point there, he explained. When you push down it relieves nausea which almost neglects your quirk's downside. It was a trick people found out in the pre-quirk era, though it's mainly forgotten now. You know those bands that work against car sickness? Well, they work exactly like this. I could buy you some for when you train if you'd like. Nausea's such an uncommon side effect, it's lucky that people already researched it, don't you think? I wonder why your quirk has that instead of sapping your energy, seeing as I think you work with energy. It's cool though. Oh. There are other pressure points as well, such as here. Izuku pressed down between her thumb and index finger. But you'd have to request for something like that in your hero costume. I searched the internet for ones that worked like this. After my third experience with a headache quirk, it got too much. Bands for these places don't exist, unfortunately. He detached himself from her and hung his hands by his side. Yurika ran a finger across the 2 points he had marked out. Thanks Midoriya. Yurika exclaimed. She removed the 2 fingers from her wrist. With her quirk activated, she picked up the same chair leg. Her eyes widened in shock from what Izuku presumed to be the lack of nausea. That's gonna be a big help. Midoriya smiled, it's the least I can do. He grabbed his notebook and sat down on the sand. Taking the time to revise his English, he opened up the textbook. Izuku began to mutter the words while he traced the words with his finger. The words didn't come naturally to him, instead he frequently flipped to the dictionary at the back of the book. The duo stayed there until Izuku could no longer see the words. The small circle he had sat down on before had expanded in area while Eureka panted. She stumbled over and collapsed beside him. Izuku shut the book and placed it to his side. "Whoa, that was tiring," Eureka said out of the blue. "At least you weren't studying English," Izuku stated. "English sounds horrible right now. All I want to do is eat and sleep." "Was it worth missing your sleep for though? This whole hero beach cleaning thing?" Izuku asked. Eureka hummed, I'm gonna be a rescue hero Eurevite. I'll use my quirk to help people from burning buildings and earthquakes alike. If I get a cool hero costume I might even go swoom." Her hand traveled in the air with her zoom action. "You won't even need a cool costume. All you need is rocket boots," Izuku pointed out. Eureka's hand fell back to her side. She pouted. "I'd prefer to use some upper quirk magic. I know, but rocket boots are still pretty cool if you ask me. I never said they weren't cool, but there are also so many quirks that rocket boots don't really compare. Like Gran Torino. His quirk is basically rocket boots, so he uses them to zoom around. Are you comparing me to a guy I've never even heard of?" "No. Not at all." Izuku's voice went high-pitched as he defended himself. His hands flew around his face. If they weren't moving so fast, Eureka would have assumed he was trying to defend himself. "I was joking, he doesn't sound so bad. I'll look him up when I get home." The two stayed on the sand. Izuku knew his mom would start buzzing his phone soon, but he didn't want to seem rude. The two drifted between conversation before Eureka whispered, "I should head home, but this man's been watching me clean the beach since 2ish. I'm worried he wants to sell me to human traffickers." True to her words, someone was standing on the promenade. A skinny man with hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. His clothes that hung off him were dirted with blood and dirt. If Izuku didn't know better, he would have called the police on the dude. Yet, when he saw the matted yellow hair that vaguely represented bunny ears, he threw that idea out of the window. "I think he wants to thank you for cleaning the beach. You go home, and if he kidnaps you I'll follow and call the police. Don't get in a car with him," Izuku stated. He pushed his friend up. Eureka sent a pleading look, but Izuku gave her a thumbs up. She climbed onto the concrete and rolled up to his feet. Izuku couldn't hear their conversation from where he sat. He could make a good guess when All Might expanded into his muscle form. If he made the right guess, All Might made a great choice. Eureka did have the heart to become the next symbol of peace. The night before the entrance exam, Inko took all Izuku's books out from his hands. Her son made a leap for the book only to fail. His mum might be small, but Izuku was still awaiting his growth spurt. Thus, smaller until further notice. He stood in front of Inko before demanding she gave it back. Inko too tared but placed the workbook on the desk beside her. "We're having a family game night. Get out your room and unwind a bit," she stated. "I need to revise, the entrance exam is tomorrow. We can change the night to tomorrow so then we both win." Izuku tried to compromise, but his mum didn't even consider it. "What will you learn tonight that you won't have already learned in the 10 months you've been studying already? Come Izuku, I'll even play hero trivia." Izuku bit his lip. "If I play, will you let me stay up later to revise?" It was fruitless, there was no way Inko would agree. His mother was dead set on making sure he slept a healthy amount. When he asked why, she explained it made her moody. Being moody ruined her relationship with her classmates. That was the reason she was held back a year in college. Moodiness wouldn't ruin his already non-existent relationships. When Inko said no, it wasn't a surprise. "This isn't up for debate. I want to play hero trivia and I need someone to make sure I don't Google all the answers." "You Google the answers anyway," Izuku pointed out. He received a stern gaze from Inko for that comment. He raised his hands up in peace. They both calmed down. "I don't have a choice in this, do I?" Izuku asks. Inko shook her head, "Nope. Now come and help me set up trivia. I still have no clue how it works." Izuku exited his room and headed towards the games cupboard. There wasn't much in there. A dusty monopoly from when people used to come round and play with Inko, battleships, and hero trivia. He took out the triangular box and placed it on the table where his mum was waiting. He removed the lid and placed the cards question up on the table. "Remember how to play now?" Izuku asked. "I remember you need to shuffle the cards," Inko said. She pulled the cards towards her and started to shuffle. "Mum, seriously, do you remember how to play?" Izuku said. Inko nodded and pushed the cards back. She chuckled, "First to 7 like normal." "Yep. You can go first, you need the advantage." "Cheek," Inko said as she rolled the dice. It landed on a red, hero history. Izuku sent his mum a pitying look, already knowing she had it wrong. He pulled the top card off the pile and asked, "What was the crime the first heroes were charged with before the Public Hero Safety Commission came to exist?" "Using quirks without a license." "Illegal quirk use," Inko guessed. She watched her son flip the card around despite already knowing the answer. "Vigilantism." He strained a smile as he placed it at the back of the pack. Inko sighed and picked up the next card. Izuku rolled the dice, landing on yellow. "Heroics now. Name 5 hero schools you can attend in Japan." "Oh. That's easy. There's UA obviously, but also Katsubatsu, Shikatsu, Isamu, and CA." Inko rolled her eyes and passed the card to Izuku. He pocketed the card and pulled the next one. As expected, Izuku won the game by round 7. Inko had collected 3 cards. "Good game," Izuku said. "Good match. I almost thought I stood a chance when you hesitated on that old pro question." "No. I knew who Nana was, she just flew out of my mind." "Was that a pun, Midoriya?" Izuku. "No. I mean yes. I didn't intend on it being a pun." "So you admit it, you make hero puns?" "Yeah. No. I don't know." Inko laughed at her son's reaction. "It's okay, no need be ashamed," she teased. "Moom." The family continued to speak round the table until Izuku had to sleep. He drifted off, having completely forgotten the entrance exam he was going to take the next day. Chapter 4, Nezu is a little shit and general education has a weird test because character is more important in getting a job than grades, and Nezu would know that. The crowd of people waiting outside of UA was uncountable. The hero exam had been the day before to allow those who were smart enough to apply for both courses. On his tiptoes, Izuku couldn't make out a face that wasn't in awe. That didn't exclude the odds no one had been there before. UA was an amazing school, and Izuku doubted he would ever get used to seeing the hero school up close. The gates opened soundlessly. Izuku couldn't hear the creaks that came from an opening door. The chatter of students could have drowned it out. People were having discussions with those standing beside them. Izuku, not being one of them. He couldn't make any words out, but he had no intention to. His eyes were set on UA as everyone started to enter the facility. Each step he took sent shockwaves down his spine, leaving it tingling. His heartbeat hammered in chest, turning his body pink from the nerves. Once on the grounds, a smile so wide it hurt graced Izuku's lips. All around him were the white walls and glass. Above him was a window where he could see the principal looking down at them all like ants. Izuku raised his hands towards the principal and waved. Nizu raised a paw back and his smile stretched larger than he thought possible. He almost jumped up and down on the spot, but someone pushed him forward. They didn't say anything when Izuku fell forward. It felt like he was going to die as Izuku plummeted towards the ground. He screwed his eyes shut so he didn't see the gravel that would meet his face. Goodbye harsh world, Izuku wouldn't miss it. There should have been around half a second before he smashed his head in. He would see Recovery Girl and sleep through the whole entrance exam. Except, someone caught him. It was a grip on his arm and a leg stuck out that his body almost crashed on that saved Izuku. His savior huffed once he was back on 2 feet. The rest of the crowd had moved forward, even though Izuku was fairly sure he hadn't been so far from the back. "Thank the heavens you're okay. I thought I'd drop you for a second and that'd be terrible," they said. Izuku dusted himself off. "Thank you. I thought I was dead for a second there," he joked. His savior, they seemed to be female, the oversized hoodie they wore did a good job hiding their gender, said. They shook their head. "You probably wouldn't have died from impact. I'd bet we'd both be dead for getting injured before we're even students by Recovery Girl though," they chuckle. "Yeah, that seems a lot more likely." Izuku agreed. "We should get going." I don't want to get lost and miss the exam. I prepared too much for that, he said. His savoir nods and takes him by the arm as they run into the hero school. It's a shame Izuku had to miss the opportunity in the rush. He can't get a look at how the staircases are all clean. How huge the doors are to compensate for those with gigantification quirks. Instead, he focuses on how unfit he is. When Izuku gets into the examination room before the explanation starts, he's out of breath. The world is spinning and he has to lean against the door for a second before he's pushed inside by midnight. The desk he sits on has his name on it, so they must have realized he was missing. It could also be so they know who draws on the tables. The kid beside him stewing it and ectoplasm looks unimpressed. Distantly, he wonders if Nizu would knock marks off for doodling. Izuku doesn't put it past the principal with his track record. It was present mic at the front of the auditorium, his voice quirk being perfect to ensure everyone could hear him. There's a megaphone by him but no one is the room with Izuku. Mike won't need it, meaning the hero was meant to be somewhere else. Alright then, is every listener here? Present, Mike asked. The auditorium is filled with silence. One or two brave kids yell out yeah before quietening down and hiding their faces on their desks. Those of who yelled, I like you. I hope you too pass, I want you in my class. Mike yells as a reassurance. They raised their heads and Mike raised a thumb in their direction before he continued, now, you are hopefuls for UA's general education course? Well, it isn't going to be easy because we aren't going to make it easy for you. When you get your test, you'll have 2 hours to answer all the questions. Do them to the best of your ability and don't worry, listeners. It's to make sure none of you have any intentions of being criminals. Nizu likes to learn about you all. You'll have an hour of lunch after that. If you forgot anything, lunch rush will be sure to make sure you're fed. Try not to make a habit of it if you're accepted though. Finally, you'll have a 3-hour test to place your intelligence before you can all go home. Are there any questions? There are no questions. Mike waits for a minute to see if anyone wants to raise a hand. When no one did, he said, right, Midnight and Ectoplasm will be handing your tests out now. Best of luck and plus ultra. Present Mike stood off the platform to stand by the door while the other pros in the room handed out the sheets of paper. Midnight placed the stack on Izuku's desk. The pile wasn't small, the 100 questions took up around 30 pages. He turned the first page around to see they were double-sided. Izuku found out what the fuck Nizu thought was important on page 1. What's your name? What's your age and birthday? What's your quirk? The first 2 questions are simple. UA had the answer due to their application process. There's no doubt they also know about his status of quirkless. He filled out the boxes. He went to turn to the next page when something clicked in his brain. They didn't want his quirk because they didn't know. Nizu wanted to learn about them. This was a test of character which explained why there were more lines than one. What was Izuku meant to say in that section? I'm quirkless, as you've probably read on my file, but people tend to mistake me having an analysis quirk. I like analysis, especially on quirks. They're really interesting and there are so many uses for them. I guess it's kinda like when a rich man can't see change because he hasn't needed it or looked at how the poor are treated. The poor can see how both the poor and the rich can change it. It's like that, there's so much potential. You see them in the same way, seeing as your quirk's high specs, and that makes you smarter than most. Not that everyone else isn't smart, but your IQ is off the charts. He hadn't realized his pen had been scrawling away until he ran out of line space. Izuku stopped where he left off and turned over the page. Do you have any siblings? Are your parents still married? Feel free to skip if this is distressing. How much wood could a woodchuck chop if a woodchuck could chuck wood? The first 2 questions were reasonable. Izuku filled the answers to them short and concise. No, he had no siblings, and no, his parents were not together or ever had been. How much wood could a woodchuck chop if a woodchuck could chuck wood was an interesting question. One Izuku was equally intrigued for an answer from. This question would be answerable if I had studied the woodchuck. It would be an equation. Yet, I wasn't interested in this, and I don't think the teachers need to be asked one more question about this. If I had to guess, I would say 600 pounds. I assume you're expecting 0 for an answer, seeing as a woodchuck can't chuck wood. What was your intention with this question? It seems to be much more a play on the mind than figuring out how we think. He moved without even thinking of the paragraph he had just written. There were bigger fish for Izuku to fry, like the questions on the next page. Did you get a good night's sleep? On a scale of 1 to 10, how nervous are you to be at UA? Who's your favorite hero? The test continued in that manner. Several of the questions seemed bizarre. Others only required yes and no answers. Izuku answered all the questions to varying amounts of information. He flipped over the page and continued on like that. At the halfway mark, the first student placed down their pen. How they had answered all the questions was beyond Izuku. He was still working on question 45. He was still answering question 98 when the bell went for the test to end. Reluctantly, Izuku placed his pen down and sighed. He had no clue how well he'd done. There wasn't a mark scheme, so how they were marked seemed to be knowledge of the teachers. Midnight was also the one to pick his test up and shoo him out the hall. Izuku followed the others into the canteen, where he slipped onto a table on his own. Inko had packed him cold soba to have in the hour dedicated to eating. She knew he'd likely be alone, so hadn't bothered to pack extras like she did when he was younger. Then, the red-haired savoir from early slid beside him. I feel awkward sitting alone, you don't mind, do you? They asked. Izuku shook his head and swallowed the noodles that were in his mouth. I don't mind at all. I'm Midoriya Izuku. Ito Rodasu. Nice to be formally acquainted. Izuku took another serving of noodles and twirled it round his chopsticks, before placing it in his mouth. Once they had been swallowed, he placed the cutlery down by the side of him. What did you think of the test? Izuku asked. I don't really understand what it was all about. Most of my answers were short, so I finished up quickly. I judged how much they wanted based on lines, but they all had 10 lines to write on. Including, what's your name? What was I meant to say that took up 10 lines? Hello Nizu, Midnight, Ectoplasm, or whomever is marking this, my name is Ito Rodasu from the Ito family. Then give them my whole ass background. Izuku laughed, but then what new information would they expect you to put for question 65? Tell us your family's history. Ito nodded. Do you reckon that test was to laugh at how panicked kids will get? I wouldn't be surprised if the true meaning was to weasel out the kids who were too scared. Izuku laughed. Guess I'm screwed then. I rambled and lost too much time on question 6. I'm an idiot, aren't I? Ito placed their chopsticks to the side and waved her hand. No. I mean, that was my interpretation. There are other reasons, because they whispered into Izuku's ear, who knows what the principal already knows and wants to know. He is, after all, well beyond a mortal's understanding. But Ito? Nizu's only in his 60s. He's not immortal. We're all immortal till we die. I don't need that on my mind before our general test. You'll be fine, Midoriya. No, Ito, I need answers now. Ito stuck her tongue out and stood up to go throw the paper box they had in the bin. The traitor didn't even finish their noodles. Izuku could see them shoveling them in their mouth. He sighed and pulled his bag up onto the table. Ito had taken their with them to the bin. They weren't coming back to continue speaking with him. That was fine. There were only 5 minutes left until the next test anyways. Izuku could just head off to the hall early. The main issue with that plan was finding the place, and even that wasn't so hard. Maybe they placed the auditorium there to make sure no one got lost for tests. Maybe Izuku had an unknown memory quirk. It was down the hallways and round the right corner. UA wasn't as big as it first appeared, Izuku realized when he turned the first right. The halls and ceilings were just extended for those with mutations, making it appear that way. He stood by the door. 3 minutes meant surely someone else was on their way to the hall. He twisted his head round the corner to see another group of people. Once they passed him, Izuku slipped in afterwards. He headed back to the desk with his name scrawled on. He sat down and listened to present Mike repeat the rules on how to pass. The packs were handed out again and the time started. Izuku looked at the first page filled with maths equations, and he had never been so glad he studied further in advance. They had never even thought of covering half of the stuff on the paper in Aldera. Izuku continued to flip through. Mentally, he was already figuring out what equations he needed. By the time Izuku had read the whole math section, the adrenaline had died down. They reminded him of the practice questions he did at home. Izuku picked up his pen and started to scribble down the working put followed by the answer. He moved on to the next question and repeated the question. The hall was silent. The only thing Izuku could focus on was the scratching of his pencil. How he liked it, silent, so only his thoughts were there to occupy him. Everyone else started to slump as the adrenaline wasted away. It left them crashing at the start of the science section. Izuku only felt the urge to crack his knuckles and hope for full marks. He flipped to the halfway point in that section. He wasn't quick, just methodic. Izuku slammed the pamphlet down with 5 minutes left. There were questions he hadn't answered, but 1 hour there was no time to waste on them. Izuku clicked his pen once before he stopped and placed it down. Checking didn't cross his mind, which he'd chastise himself for later. Those 5 minutes passed in a blur. Before Izuku knew it, he had been back on a train seat. His headphones were plugged in. While he could recount everything that happened, his mind was still processing it. The events leading to his stop seemed like a dream. Izuku had just done the UA exams and he didn't feel as if he failed. The months of revision had paid off. When Izuku opened the door, it felt as if all the energy had been sapped out of him. The house was warm in contrast to the bitterness of the outside. His body wanted to shut down and curl up. He forced himself to stay awake, even if it was only long enough to tell his mum he knew a few of the questions. "How was your day, Izuku?" Inko asked. Her head had poked through the kitchen at the sound of the door being unlocked. "I'm tired, Mum. The test was exhausting. I had to answer 200 questions, but 100 of them were about me. Me. I knew most of the material, but a few of the questions gave me a run for my money. I just want to sleep and let my brain remember the only day I set foot in UA. Don't think like that, I'm sure you got in. Go to sleep as well, I can see you're dead on your feet. I'll go make dinner." Izuku nodded and wandered into his room. When he collapsed on his bed, he was out like a light. Izuwa had chosen to moderate the general education class test from above. So when Nizu pushed a boy's file his direction, he already recognized the mop of green hair. "What's this poor kid done that you want me to see his basic information?" Izuwa asked. The wide-eyed boy's photo, where he struggled to keep a straight face, looked up at him. It had a paperclip filled with musings from the police along with his basic information. "You want to take in a kid with a criminal record?" he asked his boss. Nizu sipped his tea and leafed through the next student's test. Izuwa sighed and read the first clipping. The kid had been the victim in a mugging when he was 5. It hadn't gone well considering the mugger had done it in front of his mother. There was the average response a 5-year-old have in that situation. Lots of crying, needed a lollipop to calm down, wasn't in the mindset to be interrogated, the usual from kids. The next musing was from when Izuku was 8. The school he attended wasn't far from his household, so his mother assumed he would be alright. On the 3rd day he was a target of an unprompted assault. That was from Izuku, but after digging up his files, the man on the case assumed it was a hate crime. The rest of them went in the same notion. Mugging, a hostage, an unprompted assault before they stopped at the age of 12. "Do you think he just stopped reporting them?" Izuwa asked. It had been 4 years and a monthly occurrence. He would have stopped sooner. Nizu looked up from the paper he was currently flicking through. "Oh, almost. In fact, I would assume they only picked up rates. Middle schoolers are taken more seriously than elementary students after all. That wasn't why I showed you his file." Flip through to the final piece. Izuwa did, already preparing for the worst. He found the kid's recount of the sludge monster 10 months ago. Being a problem wasn't enough for this child, was it? He just had to cause problems. Izuwa let out another long sigh. "You want to accept him, don't you? He would certainly be quite the alumni. Quirkless and prone to self-destructive tendencies. Great things will come from that boy, Izuwa. I don't see why this concerns me. I don't teach general education. Well, if we play this correctly, you might see the change you want in the world. You'll also have him as a student, so I felt the need to run this past you first." Izuwa took another swig of his coffee and braced for the headache that would come soon. "Our students aren't chess pieces." Nizu pushed the remaining pile out of the way and sipped his tea. "Funny you say that." He started. "You see, they already are." Izuku found out the acceptance letters went out when Kiken had blown up the year's group chat. He had gotten into UA. He sat on his bed scrolling through the UA's Instagram page to see if they had released anything about who got in. Inko had no doubt already intercepted his letter. There was nothing. Izuku sighed and face planted back on his bed. God really said wait for the disappointment. He lay face back with the knowledge UA had found a way to decline him somehow. "Izuku, do you want to open your letter?" Inko called. In response, Izuku ran out of his room and collapsed beside her. He took the letter from her hand and ripped it open. A disc didn't fall out like it had for Kiken. He bit his lip and flipped, already knowing what was coming. Dear Midoriya Izuku. Welcome to UA's Class 1C. All the information regarding your results and what you'll need is attached. Plus Ultra, Nizu. Izuku Midoriya couldn't stop crying at the news. He'd made it. He was in UA, he'd finally be able to learn all the halls. Alright, that's where we'll leave off for the day. Thanks so much for listening along with me today. If you enjoyed, please like and comment down below. It really helps with the algorithms. I look forward to seeing you next time. Ciao for now, lovelies.